Everything can be hacked, and everyone.
Indeed, so since the majority of you have voted for new shader graph tutorial while I'm playing Overwatch, which is an addictive game for me, I saw this nice Sombra visual effect when you hack something in the game like the medkit so the enemy team can't get it. So I decided to hack into the Unity shader graph and recreate this visual effect for you guys. So let's analyze what this visual effect consists of, then create the shader graph of it in Unity engine. To start, we need the Sombra logo, which is available to download online. I provided the link in the description. And we need to create a scrolling hex texts. I created in Photoshop in addition to glows. I'll show you how to create that too. Then we need to create a distortion layer. And also we can duplicate that to make this effect look even better. And finally, if you realized with each blink, the hex text changes. So we will do that also by code. And finally, I added some post-processing like the bloom and the film grain. So let's create a new Unity 2D project, name it Sombra Hack Shader Graph. Once the project is ready, let's go to Window, Package Manager, and install the Universal Rendering Pipeline. Then in the Project tab, right-click Create Rendering, Universal Render Pipeline asset, and let's name it Render Pipeline. It auto creates a default renderer with it, so we can delete that default renderer. Then right-click, Create Rendering, Universal Rendering Pipeline, and 2D renderer. We set that 2D renderer as a default inside the render pipeline. Then we go to Edit, Project Settings, to the Quality tab, and set that as a default renderer. Also, we do the same in the Quality tab. In the 2D renderer, you can also activate the HDR if you are planning to add post-processing later. Let's start by downloading the Sombra Plane logo. I provided the link down in the description. And also let me change the background for the camera to black. That makes me more comfortable. And if you drag the logo to the scene, you will find it black because it's lit and there is no 2D lights in the scene. So go back to the 2D renderer and change the default material to be unlit, then drag back the logo so you can see it in the scene. Let's create the shader. So create shader 2D renderer sprite unlit graph. Let's name it Sombra shader, double click to open it. Then as any previous shader graph we created before, we need to start with sample texture 2D to get the sprite from our game object. So let's name it Sombra Logo, set the reference to underscore main text and select the Sombra logo. Then link that property to the sample texture 2D texture field. Then link the RGB4 to color and change the preview to quad so you can see the sprite perfectly. Now let's create the scrolling hex text in Photoshop. Let's go to Photoshop, create any document size. I chose the web default size. Then set the background color to something like light violet, same as the Sombra logo. Then I went to a website called Hex Text Generator. I provide the link down in the description. I set it to 200 digits and 200 lines. Click generate and copied the text I got, so it auto generates numbers and letters, so I don't need to write them randomly. Then select the text tool, select all the area available to you, and on the top change the color to white, of course. Then on the top left there is the text orientation. You need to change it to be vertically. And once you pasted the randomly generated hex text, you can add random gaps between the lines. So they don't need to be a full complete line from top to down. You can create some gaps to make some variety in the texture. Then you can duplicate the text, decrease the transparency of the second copy, and move it up so it appears like the texts are fading while they are falling. Then you can rasterize both the text, merge them, and apply Gaussian blur to them, which will make them look better. Save the sprite as PNG, import it to Unity project. Then now we need to create another sample texture 2D node and another texture 2D property. Let's name this scrolling hex texture, and we can give them or it a reference underscore hex text, so we can access it using code later. Then select the texture we just created, then link the property to sample texture 2D node. We need to move the texture over time, so let's create time node, and we need to control the speed, so let's multiply the time with a new property, vector1 property. Let's name it hex scrolling speed and set the default value to 0.2. Then we need to control the texture by creating tiling and offset node, link the results of the multiply to the offset, then link the result of tiling and offset to the UV on the sample texture 2D node. But after doing that, you will notice that the texture disappeared, and that's because the wrap mode of the texture is set to clamp, while you need to change it to repeating, so the texture repeats itself over time. But as you can see, also we have another problem. The text is moving to bottom left while we need it to move down, and it's because we created a vector1 property which doesn't allow controlling separate axes, the x and y. So let's delete the vector1 property, create vector2 property, scrolling hex speed, then control the y value only and set it to 0.2, then replace the vector2 with the vector1. Now we need to make the scrolling text to be rendered inside the logo, so we need to get the colors from the scrolling text and add the alpha from the logo. So we combine the colors, the RGB, with the alpha from the logo, then we link the results to the color, and now we can see the hex text scrolling nicely inside the logo. Then of course, to see the results in the scene, we need to create a material that holds the shader graph. So let's create a new material. Let's name it Sombra, then drag the shader graph onto the material, then drag the material onto the Sombra logo on the scene. Now let's go back to Photoshop to create the falling glows texture. All what we need to do is change the background color to black, then pick the normal brush and make sure its opacity set to less than 100, maybe 70% is good. And the brush size with soft edges around 40, the size of the brush. Then click anywhere 2 or 3 clicks to create a nice sphere or circle with faded edges. Then we use the smudge tool to create the tail of the falling glow. So select the smudge tools, hold shift so you can do a straight line, and click and drag upward till you get a nice tail for the falling glows. You can also hide the texts so you can see the tail very nicely. Then you can duplicate this effect or this glow falling thing as much as you need. In the original Sombra effect, it's nearly in each row or column of those falling texts. So you can duplicate this to match exactly the number of the columns, but with scattering them randomly. I'll fast forward here and scatter this randomly. Now you can hide the text and save the texture as PNG and import it to Unity. Now we can repeat the steps we did for the scrolling hex. So we create sample texture 2D, we create new texture 2D property, falling glows. We set it to the falling glows PNG we just exported from Photoshop. We link it to the sample texture 2D. Then we can copy all the nodes we created to make this scroll effect. We just only need to change the scrolling speed. So we copy all those nodes and we create new property vector2 falling glows speed, and we change the speed on the y-axis to 0.6. So it can move faster than the normal scrolling hex. Then we need to create a mask that covers the black areas and only shows the falling glows, so we can merge it with the scrolling hex. So we need here a color mask, and we will be masking using the white color and set the range to 1 and set the fuzziness to 0.73. I think that's perfect. Maybe we need to reduce it a bit. Yeah, 0.73 seems perfect. Now we need to make those falling glows only appear inside the Sombra logo. So again, we use the combine node to combine the colors from the falling glows with the alpha of the Sombra logo, so they are shows only inside the logo itself. Then to control the color and the transparency of the falling glows, we can create a new color property, falling glows color, then multiply it with the last results. To avoid any weird brightness, since we added two textures to each other, that means their alpha added above each other's. That means we can reach an alpha above 1, which create unpleasantful brightness. So to avoid that, we can create clamp node, which forces the alpha to be between 0 and 1. And if you didn't see things being rendered in the scene, probably that's because the texture of the falling glows is not added to the game object in the scene. So select the game object there and make sure that the falling glows texture is selected. Also make sure that the wrap mode has been set to repeating. And to keep things organized and clean, let's group all the nodes related to the falling glows into one group called falling glows, and group all the nodes related to the scrolling hex in a group called scrolling hex. Now let's create the distortion effect, and that can be done easily by accessing or creating a UV node, then accessing its y-axis by splitting it using a split node to reach the green channel which represents the y-axis. Then we need a simple noise node, and we get the distortion on the y-axis to give a distortion horizontally. Then we can control the power of distortion by creating a new property, distortion control. It's a vector1 property. Multiply it with the noise, so we can control the amount of noise. Then we use an add node to add those together with the original UV value. Then we link the results with the UV on the sample texture 2D of the original Sombra logo. As you can see now, the logo getting distorted. The only bad point about this is getting distorted inside the alpha of the logo itself. So the only solution I've found to create exactly the same as the effect in Overwatch is to create multiple game objects of the Sombra logo itself, then control the distortion on each of them to reach the exact effect. So let's create a new game object, name it Sombra Shader to hold all the layers of the Sombra logo. Drag inside it the Sombra logo itself to be a child, then duplicate the Sombra logo and rename the new game object to distortion layer 1. Then create a new material, name it distortion 1. Drag the shader graph on it, then drag the distortion material to the distortion layer 1 game object. Then we can decrease the alpha of the second layer or the distortion layer 1 to something like 120 to show the original logo behind it. Now let's create the distortion animation. Select the Sombra shader game object. Then in the animation tab, hit the create animation. Let's name it distortion animation. Hit record, and in the first frame, we set the distortion value to 0. Then we move to frame number 5 and set the distortion to something like 0.5. Since 0.2 is more than enough, then move the distortion layer 1 position to top right a bit, so we can see the original photo is like being distorted to the right. Then copy the same location and the value of the distortion from first frame to frame number 10. Then we can repeat the process in the other direction. So we set the distortion value to minus 0.2 and move the distortion layer 1 to the bottom left on frame 15. Then we return them back to the original position and distortion value at frame 20, and we get this nice blink of distortion. As we can see now, we not only duplicated the Sombra logo, we also duplicated the falling glows and textures, which make it not clear to be seen. So first we can change the color of the distortion layer 1, and we remove the scrolling hex texture, and we remove also the falling glows to get the original logo clearly can be seen behind the distortion layer 1. Then I repeated the process to create distortion layer 2, created a different material for it, distortion 2 material, applied it to that game object, changed the color of the distortion layer 2, removed the hex texture and falling glows from it, and I did an animation that starts after the first animation ends to the top right to reach this nice distortion blink. And the final thing we need to do is to create 2 more alternatives of the falling hex, because in the Sombra original effect, the text changes each second, each time the distortion blink happens. So let's create 2 additional alternatives for the text, hex text, from Photoshop by generating 2 different texts from that website I provided you, create 2 additional PNGs, then import them to Unity. Now let's create the code that changes the hex texture randomly. So let's select Sombra Shader, create a new script, name it Sombra Hex Changer. Open the script and let's start writing some codes. In this code, we need a list of sprites. Let's name it hex texture list to hold all the alternatives of the texture. Then we need public materials, some material, so we can gain access to the shader which is connected to the material. And we can access that by getting the component sprite renderer and getting its material. Then we need an integer to hold the current index, the current selected texture, and we need an enumerator to create a coroutine that each 1 second choose a texture randomly. So we create a new integer, random index, we set it to 0, and then we set the random index to select randomly from 0 to the number of the textures available, which can be accessed by calling hex texture list.count to count the number of textures available in the list. Then we create a while loop to keep looping as long as the current index is the same random index. And why we need that? Because sometimes when you keep selecting randomly, by coincidence, you keep selecting the same texture. To avoid that case, we keep looping as long as the random index is equal to the current index. Then when it's not equal, we go out of the loop and set the current index to the random new index. Then we change the material texture. So we call the material SomMaterial dot set texture, and then we call the name of the texture inside the shader graph, which we named, if you remember, underscore hex text. Then we change that hex text texture to the newly randomly selected texture. Then we repeat the coroutine by calling itself again. And of course, I forgot to add a line to wait 1 second between the iterations. So let's write yield return new wait for seconds 1 second. And of course, we need to call the coroutine itself in the start function. Save the script, and in Unity Inspector, assign the 3 alternative of the hex texture, hit play, and nothing will change. Let's see what the error we got. We couldn't find the sprite renderer because we attached the code to the Sombra shader game object, which doesn't have a sprite renderer, while we should have attached to the original logo itself, the Sombra Logo game object. So let's delete the script from Sombra shader and re-add it to the Sombra Logo and re-add the texture alternatives there, hit play, and now we got it working. So as you can see, each 1 second we get a distortion blink and the texture changes. If the blink is not synced with the texture changes, make sure that the animation you created is 60 frames, which equals 1 second. And as a final touch, we can make this effect look more beautiful by enabling the post-processing on camera, then adding the volume script to it, and add a bloom override to create the glow. Increase the intensity to 1 and the threshold to 1. Then you can adjust those, of course, to reach the results you want. Also, you can add a tint. You can add a pinkish tint to it to make it nice pinkish glow. Also, you can control the scatter of them so you can make them less glowy. Then we can add finally a film grain post-processing effect. So enable it, set it to type maybe medium 5, increase the intensity to maximum, and we got this final awesome results, which it looks like exactly same as in Overwatch with 90%, if not totally the same. That's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed watching. Don't forget to join our Discord server to tell us what you think about it and suggest the next videos. And of course, we are deeply thankful to our supporters on Patreon: Ovino, Shaharbar, Dertrek, Alexei Fix, Dmitry Vasiliev, Breadman, Joshua Kratochville, Parker Nelson, Giacomo Mariani, Falcon Jazz, Jess Fever, Pedro Transong, Jans Valentine, Rick Jaworski, Jack Crystal, and Mohammed Aiden. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Till next time, see you soon.